Good day. The last 24 to 36 hours have been hours of disaster for Ukraine in the battles in northern Donbass. I don't think this is an overstatement. Even publications like the New York Times are now conceding, however reluctantly, the grim state of the situation for the Ukrainian army, trying to defend undefendable positions, at least in my opinion, in northern Donbass. Briefly, the Russian military has now captured a whole string of towns and small towns and settlements across northern Donbass, locking the door onto major cauldrons, encirclements, traps, call them what you will, of the Ukrainian forces. One is the one that I was discussing yesterday in the area of Gorsky Zolota, and the other, of course, is the bigger one in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. Now, the key point to understand is that about Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, is that the Russians essentially control Severodonetsk. They captured it, as I've discussed many times, several weeks ago, without much fighting, by the way. But it's now clear, as I also have previously discussed, that the remaining Ukrainian troops that were rushed to Severodonetsk, very unwisely, in my opinion, to try to maintain some kind of military presence in the town, and who staged that famous, fictitious counterattack that we were reading about so much about a short time ago, that those troops are now bottled up in the Azot chemical works, and they are essentially surrounded there. But up to fairly recently, they were able to maintain some kind of tenuous contact with the other Ukrainian troops in the neighboring town of Lysychansk, which is across the river, the Seversky Donetsk River, from Severodonetsk. Now it seems that those very tenuous connections have now also been cut, and that the troops in the Azot chemical works find themselves in exactly the same position as the Ukrainian troops who were previously at the Azovstal factory in Mariupol, completely surrounded, with no hope of relief and with all hope of resupply ended. But it gets worse, because we now have confirmation that Lysychansk itself has been cut off. The Ukrainian military grouping in the town of Lysychansk is cut off. Now, I say that there was a German journalist from BITCHUTE who was in the town. He's just managed to escape. He was reporting, as he did escape, that Lysychansk was almost completely cut off. That was when he left. But I understand that in the hours since he left, the trap around Lysychansk has, to all intents and purposes, been slammed shut. Now, I say that there's perhaps still a few minor access points left, but overall, the Ukrainian grouping in Lysychansk is now also cut off without hope of resupply. In fact, there was a rather sad photograph from Reuters, a British news agency, a famous British news agency, whose reports about the war I frankly found very unreliable. That's all I'm going to say about them in this program. But anyway, there was a rather sad photograph from Reuters which showed Ukrainian boats, a Ukrainian boat with some soldiers crossing the Seversky Donetsk River in what appeared to be a heavily forested environment. That might have been closer to the city of ETHEREUM, which is under Russian control, but some have suggested that this is in fact an indicator of how the Ukrainians are trying to keep Lysychansk itself resupplied? Well, if so, then that really does point to the desperate state of the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers in Lysychansk. All of this coming on top of confirmation that other Russian troops are now within 5 kilometers of Bakhmut, the main area in the rear, the town where the Ukrainians have their main supply point and base area in the rear, and from which they have been sending supplies to Lysychansk and Severodonetsk earlier in the battle. And the New York Times said that these events put the Ukrainian military in a difficult position, that they have a dilemma now. Do they evacuate their troops from these areas in northern Donbass, which would mean, in effect, surrendering the whole of Lugansk region to the Russians, or do they stand and fight and risk encirclement? To my mind, and I think those who follow these programs will anticipate what I'm going to say, to my mind, this is a completely false dilemma. The answer to it is obvious. Of course you pull your troops out, assuming, obviously, that you still can. There's no sense in holding on to territory that you're going to lose anyway, and having your troops encircled and destroyed trying to hold it. I would have thought this was obvious. As I repeatedly say, I am not a military person. I'm not an armchair general or anything like that. But it seems to me that considerations not just of basic humanity, but obvious common sense dictate that you don't hold on to undefendable positions, which you're going to lose anyway. You pull your troops back so that they can survive and perhaps fight another day. Now, I am well aware of the argument that many people have been making, that Ukraine is fighting some great war of attrition against the Russians. It's bleeding the Russians in Donbass. It's playing for time. It's waiting to build up its forces in central and western Ukraine so that it can go on to the launch some kind of counteroffensives. And I've seen comparisons made with how the Soviets slowed down the German advances in the first months of the German attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, and built up their rear and rearmed their forces in the rear, re-equipped and rearmed their forces in the rear, and were able to launch counterattacks. Well, it seems to me that this is a completely false analogy. Far from the Russians facing attrition in Donbass, it is the Ukrainians who are facing the attrition, who are losing men and troops and supplies, and who are as a result becoming weaker, and who are finding it ever more difficult, therefore, to continue the war, and who will find it more difficult still when those troops in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk region and in the Gorsky Zolotoy region, perhaps 20,000 all told, these are just guesses, when all of those troops are either destroyed, killed, or wounded, or in any event forced to lay down their arms. This is a false concept of how to fight this war. The analogies are not the same. Ukraine simply doesn't have the kind of strategic depth that the Soviet Union had in 1941, and, by the way, which Russia also has today. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. Now, it's not just bad news for Ukraine in northern Donbass. It's also bad news for Ukraine in Kharkiv region. There's been more advances by the Russian forces. They're now coming ever closer to Kharkiv city itself. No one that I know believes that the Russian plan is to storm Kharkiv but they seem to be positioning themselves on the outskirts of the city, preparing perhaps for some event around Kharkiv, presumably when the rest of Donbass has been cleared. Now, it would not be a complete summary of the situation in Ukraine if I didn't also mention that there's been some reports, though they are disputed, that in another area of the battlefield in the southern regions, close to the city of Zaporozhye, Ukraine did launch some sort of a counteroffensive, counterattack, and there are some reports that they captured the minor settlement of Pavlovka. But that's one little place compared to disastrous defeats elsewhere, and nobody that I follow seriously believes that the Ukrainians will be able to hold on to Pavlovka for very long. And by the way, it's the same story elsewhere. The Ukrainians have been repeatedly talking about successful counteroffensives in Kherson region. There's always been talk about the Ukrainians going on the attack in Kherson region, recapturing Kherson city, doing these things. I have given up trying to remember how many of these Ukrainian counteroffensives towards Kherson have been talked about and launched ever since the middle of March. All of them, without exception, have come to nothing. So, yes, the Ukrainians achieved one small advance near Zaporozhye. It doesn't come close to balancing out the massive defeat the Ukrainians have suffered in northern Donbass, which paves the way for a collapse of their resistance in that part of Ukraine, the loss of a significant part of their army, and the strengthening of Russian positions once they have captured the whole of Lugansk region, which it is now clear is about to fall. Anyway, I'm now going to discuss this issue of strategic depth, because it seems to me that this is the key to understanding the course of this war. And every so often we get in the military media here in the West, sometimes in Britain, sometimes in the United States, we get glimmers of the truth. Now, many of us, of course, have had to listen for far too long to this endless trope that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country, that Russia doesn't actually make anything. That was what no less a person than President Obama said. There was that extraordinary comment by that White House official way back in February, at the time when the sanctions were imposed, about Russia being a one-dimensional economy. Well, we've now had a very interesting analysis about the state of the war, the Ukrainian war, and some of the lessons it teaches us from the Royal United Services Institute in Britain. Now, this is a very important military think tank in Britain. In fact, it's one of the oldest such military think tanks in the world. It goes back, well, centuries. And I don't really like to call it a think tank, because the people who work in it are highly professional, and they're people who understand war or write extensively about war, and they talk about the situations in war. They think about war very hard, and they often produce some extremely interesting and objective readings about military events. Anyway, we've now had a very interesting article by somebody called Alex Vershinin, a name that points to Russian extraction, but I don't know anything about this person. But somebody called Alex Vershinin, and he writes about the return of industrial warfare. And may I stress again, this is published by the Royal United Services Institute. And by the way, any institute that contains royal in its title, well, that tells you firstly that it's old, and secondly that it is right at the centre of the British military establishment. Anyway, the article goes on to say, can the West still provide the arsenal of democracy? And I'm going to read this article in full because I think it's so interesting and it's so revealing, and I'm just going to pass it in a few places. So this is what this article says. The war in Ukraine has proved that the age of industrial warfare is still here. The massive consumption of equipment, vehicles, and ammunition requires a large-scale industrial base for resupply. Quantity still has a quality of its own. By the way, the expression quantity has a quality all of its own is probably Russian and is attributed sometimes to Lenin and sometimes to Stalin when talking about war. But note also that this person, Mr. Vershinin, talks about the importance of an industrial base for resupply. And then this is what he goes on to say. The mass-scale combat has pitted 250,000 Ukrainian soldiers together with 450,000 recently mobilized soldiers against about 200,000 Russian and separatist troops. Now, just take a pause and think about those figures. It shows that Ukraine massively outnumbers, in terms of manpower, the Russian and allied forces in Ukraine. And yet it is losing the Battle of Donbass. In other words, Russia is fighting with an expeditionary force made up of professional troops drawn from its peacetime army. It is not mobilized for war, whereas Ukraine is mobilized for war, and the result is that it has about 650,000 men fighting 200,000 Russian and allied troops, and yet Ukraine, fully mobilized and with the backing of the West, as I've discussed, is still losing. And then Mr. Vershinin goes on to explain why. The effort to arm, feed and supply these armies is a monumental task. Ammunition resupply is particularly onerous. For Ukraine, compounding this task are Russian deep fire capabilities, which target Ukrainian military industry and transportation networks throughout the depth of the country. The Russian army has also suffered from Ukrainian cross-border attacks and acts of sabotage, but at a smaller scale. Well, much smaller scale. There's no comparison. Minor pinpricks like the kamikaze drone attack on a Russian oil refinery, which the Russians can make up without any difficulty. And then Mr. Vershinin goes on to say the rate of ammunition and equipment consumption in Ukraine can only be sustained by a large-scale industrial base. And then he goes on to say this: the reality should be a concrete warning to Western countries who have scaled down military-industrial capacity and sacrificed scale and effectiveness for efficiency. This strategy relies on flawed assumptions about the future of war and has been influenced by both the bureaucratic culture in Western governments and the legacy of low-level intensity conflicts. Currently, the West may not have the industrial capacity to fight a large-scale war. If the US government is planning to once again become the arsenal of democracy, then the existing capabilities of the US military-industrial base and the core assumptions that have driven its development need to be re-examined. Now, I would, by the way, query one paragraph in that article. I don't think there's any sign here that there is any degree of efficiency in Western military and arms procurement. But anyway, let me proceed further. Now he's talking about the fighting in Ukraine itself. There is no exact ammunition consumption data available for the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Neither government publishes data, but an estimate of Russian ammunition consumption can be calculated using the official fire missions data provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense during its daily briefings. And then he goes into very great detail about how much a Russian battery expends. A battery of 6 guns expends in a fire mission. He estimates that that comes to around 7,176 rounds a day. And he talks about the various fire missions that are taking place. And of course, he emphasizes that these are estimates on the low side. And I'm not going to go into these calculations, they're very complicated. And then he goes on to say, the winner in a prolonged war between two near-peer powers is still based on which side is the strongest industrial base. A country must either have the manufacturing capacity to build massive quantities of ammunition or have other manufacturing industries that can be rapidly converted to ammunition production. Unfortunately, the West no longer seems to have either. And then he discusses this. He says that the United States is decreasing its artillery ammunition stockpiles. In 2020, artillery ammunition purchases decreased by 36% to $425 million. In 2022, the plan is to reduce expenditure on 155 millimeter artillery rounds to $174 million. And then he then goes on to say, in short, US annual artillery production would at best only last for 10 days to 2 weeks of combat in Ukraine. If the initial estimate of Russian shells fired is over by 50%, it would only extend the artillery supplied for 3 weeks. So the Russians can saturate the field with artillery because they have this huge industrial base churning out shells, and they're able to keep doing it day after day, week after week, month after month. The United States, the great arsenal of democracy, can only match this level of ammunition expenditure by Russia in a localized conflict where the Russians are only fighting, as I said, with an expeditionary force drawn from their peacetime army. The United States can only sustain this level of ammunition expenditure for between 2 weeks to 3 weeks, depending on calculations of how much ammunition the Russians are expending. And then the article goes on to say the US is not the only country facing this challenge. In a recent war game involving US, UK and French forces, UK forces exhausted national stockpiles of critical ammunition after 8 days. And then he goes on to say this is not only the case with artillery. Anti-tank javelins and air defense Stingers are in the same boat. The US shipped 7,000 Javelin missiles to Ukraine, roughly 1/3 of its stockpile, with more shipments to come. Lockheed Martin produces about 2,100 missiles a year, though this number might ramp up to 4,000 in a few years. So the United States cannot even replace in any measurable time period, in any rapid time period, the amount of Javelin anti-tank missiles it has already sent to Ukraine. And then he goes on to say, Ukraine claims to use 500 Javelin missiles a day. 500 a day, against current production by the United States of 2,100 missiles in a year. I mean, Ukraine is running through in 4 days, if it really is using 500 Javelin missiles a day, it's running through in 4 days the total amount of these missiles that the United States uses in a year, builds in a year. Personally, I think this Ukrainian number is wildly exaggerated. I'm sure Ukraine isn't using anything close to 500 Javelin missiles a day, but it could be using anti-tank missiles, 500 anti-tank missiles a day, though it must be said with very limited effect. Now, that gives us some idea of how quickly the United States arsenals of anti-tank missiles are being depleted. It can't keep up with Ukraine's production levels. Well, what about the Russians? Now we come to perhaps the most interesting part of the whole discussion here. And this is what this person has to say. The expenditure of cruise missiles and theater ballistic missiles is just as massive. The Russians have fired between 1,100 and 2,100 missiles. The United States currently purchases 110 Prism, 500 JASM, and 60 Tomahawk missiles annually, meaning that in 3 months of combat, Russia has burnt through 4 times the US annual missile production. The Russian rate of production can only be estimated. Russia started missile production in 2015 in limited initial runs, and even in 2016 the production runs were estimated at 47 missiles. This means that it had only 5 to 6 years of full-scale production. The initial stockpile in February 2022 is unknown, but considering expenditures and the requirement to hold substantial stockpiles back in case of war with NATO, it is unlikely that the Russians are worried. In fact, they seem to have enough to expend operational level cruise missiles on tactical targets. The assumption that there are 4,000 cruise and ballistic missiles in the Russian inventory is not unreasonable. This production will probably increase despite Western sanctions. In April, ODYSEE Saturn, which makes Calibre missile motors, announced an initial 500 job openings. This suggests that even in this field, the West only has parity with Russia. In fact, if you unpack it, they clearly don't just have parity. The Russians clearly don't just have parity. They have superiority, probably extensive superiority in missile production. Because the point that Vershinin is making is that since the Russians have only had 5 to 6 years of missile production, cruise missile production, it's inconceivable that they have built up the kind of, that they're drawing all their missiles from already existing stocks. They must be expending missiles, to some extent at least, from current production, so that they can keep this level of missile launches going pretty much indefinitely. That's why he says that the Russians are not worried. Every few weeks, we hear reports in the West that the Russians have run through their output of cruise missiles, that the expenditure of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that the Russians have is going to start running down. Well, Vershinin shows the fallacy of this whole this whole approach. And he also, by the way, discusses the enormous difficulties of replacing, of resuming, rebuilding production capacity. He says generating new capacity is very challenging, especially as there is so little manufacturing capacity left to draw skilled workers from. This is especially challenging because many older ammunition production systems are labor intensive to the point where they are practically built by hand, and it takes a long time to train a new workforce. The supply chain issues are also problematic because subcomponents may be produced by a subcontractor who either goes out of business with loss of orders or retools for other customers, or who relies on parts from overseas, possibly from a hostile country. And this is where Vashinin is talking about the fact that the United States, its military industries work on a just-in-time basis. Russia does not use a just-in-time basis for any part of its industrial economy, certainly not for its military industrial economy. And of course, the United States depends on critical imports such as rare earths, obviously largely imported from China, which would be a problem to replace in the event of a conflict with that country. Anyway, he then goes on to say that the Russians can basically sustain this, and that they're essentially outproducing not just Ukraine, which has no military industrial capacity left, but essentially that they can outproduce from their existing industrial base any weapon systems that the United States and the West supplies to Ukraine. And he even points out how the United States has experienced in some of its recent wars critical shortages in ammunition. For example, it actually ran out for a brief period of small arms ammunition during the Iraq wars. And then he comes to this conclusion: the war in Ukraine demonstrates that war between peer or near-peer adversaries demands the existence of a technically advanced, mass-scale industrial age production capacity. The Russian onslaught consumes ammunition at rates that massively exceed US forecasts and ammunition production. For the United States to act as the arsenal of democracy in defense of Ukraine, there must be a major look at the manner and scale at which the US organizes its industrial base. Well, that's all very well, but changing your entire military industrial base, changing your entire military industrial procurement system is something that will take a decade. The Russians started reorganizing their military industrial base from around the year 2006, 2007, after the initial recovery from the 1990s crisis. And of course, it's taken them a long time to get back with the kind of military industrial base that they have now, which is able to sustain these kind of levels of production. Well, the United States is a much richer country. It's got a bigger economy overall. It could probably turn things round faster if it put its mind to it. But the latter point already points to some of the problems, because would the United States put its mind to it? Would it approach this kind of problem with that kind of urgency that Russia showed in the mid-2000s? The bureaucratic obstacles, the enormous complexities of the US military-industrial complex, the frankly massive cost overruns, the lobbying systems that operate in Congress, would all those permit the kind of reorganization that the Russians have been able to carry through in the last 15 plus years, and reconstruction of a military industrial base that the Russians were able to do in the last 15 plus years. Could the United States actually do that, even if the notional capacities are there? Well, I'm skeptical. I think in a period of emergency, something like that might be done, but I have to say, I think it's most unlikely. And then we come to the big issue, because here we're talking about the United States versus Russia. Russia is able to outproduce the United States in critical weapon systems, in ammunition, in missile production, in all kinds of things. But that's Russia. Not, let's be straightforward about it, the biggest industrial power. That is another one. And this is what Vershinin has to say about this. This situation is especially critical because behind the Russian invasion stands the world's manufacturing capital, China. As the US begins to expend more and more of its stockpiles to keep Ukraine in the war, China has yet to provide any meaningful assistance to Russia. The West must assume that China will not allow Russia to be defeated, especially due to lack of ammunition. If competition between autocracies and democracies has really entered a military phase, then the arsenal of democracy must first radically improve its approach to the production of material in wartime. Now, I think Vershinin actually is being a little mischievous here, because of course there's no reason to think that the Russians are going to have to call on the Chinese for help in military production, because from their point of view, they are, as we see, already effectively outproducing the West in critical weapon systems, the kind of weapon systems that are actually making the difference in the battle. And there isn't anything realistically that the West can do to turn that situation round. Not in any acceptable or possible timescales. But there is a much bigger issue here, because if the US would struggle to keep up with Russia, what hope does it have against China, given China's much bigger industrial base, an industrial base that dwarfs Russia and is much bigger than that of the United States itself? And of course, if the United States is using up all its stockpiles to try to support Ukraine in a local war against Russia, then imagine what's happening in the balance of power in the Far East. The Chinese, with their immeasurably bigger manufacturing capacities, we must assume are adding to their stockpiles all the time. Probably these already exceed, perhaps far exceed in scale, those of the United States. There's all this talk about a confrontation looming between China and the United States and the Pacific. The United States is depleting its stockpiles, trying to support Ukraine, failing to do so, even whilst the Chinese, with their immeasurably bigger industrial capacity, must be increasing the scale of theirs. Now, I think people in Washington, people in London, people in Brussels need to take a step back and think about what all of this means. Certainly, it seems to me that here we see yet another reason why the United States needs to end this war quickly. It's not Russia that has been bled dry by this war. In terms of depletion of stocks, it is the United States. The Russians can sustain this level probably indefinitely, without strain, and we see that they're able to do it, and inflation in Russia has been turned into deflation. So this arms spending is not causing any strains within the Russian economy. Their industrial base is big enough that they can sustain this level of ammunition and missile use, and they can just go on doing it day after day, week after week, even as the United States would struggle to achieve the same thing. But the United States, by contrast, is depleting its reserves. Not all of its reserves. It's not, losing aircraft, because the US Air Force is not being engaged in this war. It's not obviously using ships, but it's expending critical amounts of ammunition, of missiles. It's depleting these reserves in a struggle with Russia, even as China is building up, one must assume, its reserves of all of these things. So it seems to me that given what we see from this article, which I repeat again, is from RUSI, this is about as establishment as it gets in terms of military analysis and military production analysis. It's important that the United States and the Western powers, if they really want to get into a competition with China, including a military competition in China, it's important that they take a step back and think through the implications of what they're doing and ask themselves this question of whether they can really sustain this war and whether they can sustain it for much longer. Now, putting all that aside, putting all these big issues about the geopolitical balance, the overall military balance in the world, consider anyway the implications of what this article on RUSI says specifically about the war in Ukraine. The reason why the United States can only send limited amounts of howitzers, limited amounts of artillery shells, small dribbles of multiple rocket launch systems to Ukraine is because it doesn't have that many of them to start with, and its ability to produce more is limited. By contrast, the Russians, as I said, can just go on churning these things out because their industrial base is organized, their military industrial base is organized to do it. That means that any idea of building up some great reserve army by Ukraine in western and central Ukraine and launching it in some great counter-offensive against the Russians, that kind of idea is hopeless. The United States doesn't have the 500 tanks, 300 multiple launch rocket systems, 1,000 howitzers, and all the ammunition and logistics needed to keep all that kind of arsenal supplied. It doesn't have that to spare and to give to Ukraine, and it can't produce all of that in the time needed for Ukraine to turn things round. I mean, you could find across the US military, NATO, all of these systems, but if you did supply them to Ukraine, that would create a massive dent in the West's military profile, the US's military profile, which would be difficult to replace. And of course, what you'd end up with, you'd only get back to a situation where, in terms of numbers of weapons, Ukraine was put essentially back in the same position that it was in February before the war started. Ukraine has already admitted that it's lost around 50% of its equipment over the course of this war, and that sort of matches fairly closely the amount of weapons that Ukraine is asking the West to supply. So if the Russians were able to destroy half Ukraine's arsenal within the period of 4 months that this war has gone on for, if all of these weapon systems were supplied to Ukraine, quite likely, given Russian domination of the air, given Russia's ability to launch cruise missiles and attack Ukraine in every sort of place, to launch cruise missiles against even tactical targets, well, given that the Russians possess these capabilities, the likelihood is that all those Western weapon systems, even if they were supplied to Ukraine, even if Ukraine were trained to use them, that they'd be lost very quickly as well. In fact and in practice, and this has been pointed out by various people, the new Atlas, for one, there's simply no conceivable possibility that this could happen, and there's no conceivable time frame in which the Ukrainians could be retrained to use these weapons, or at least to use them effectively. So there we are. The military balance, the logic of this war, shows that Ukraine cannot sustain this war effort, and the West cannot help Ukraine do so. And I come back to what I'm saying. Given these realities, and they're not realities ultimately that one can argue against, given these realities, is it not wiser to admit to this and try to come to some sort of settlement and agreement now, sparing us a debacle? Well, there's been some suggestions. There was an interesting article, this interesting discussion about in the US magazine National Interest about a possible peace plan. But as we see, there is still an inability by many people in the West, including in Western governments, to face up to the reality of that. And there are serious problems with this supposed peace plan, which I'm going to discuss in my next program. I think it's a non-starter, actually, but we'll discuss that later, as I said, in another program. And of course, we've also had other developments in the economic front. We had a very confident Putin now addressing a conference of businessmen, business people from the BRICS group, in a conference put together by the Chinese, by Xi Jinping himself. And he let slip in one sentence, it was quite an interesting little sentence actually, in which he just let slip very, very briefly the fact that the BRICS groups are, well, I'll quote the sentence, "We are exploring the possibility of creating an international reserve currency based on the basket of BRICS currencies." There's one little sentence. One wonders quite what the implications of that are. With the ruble today trading at 53 rubles to the dollar, at least as of the time of this program, and with China's manufacturing capacity there, and with India's economy going from strength to strength, a BRICS reserve currency, it seems to me, if it's ever created based on a basket of BRICS currencies, well, that would sweep the board. But, let's wait and see. Maybe that was just a little aside that Putin made. I don't think so. I'm going to discuss that again in more detail in another program. Lastly, last but not least, we now have more grim news in the West. Britain, as I said, seems to be spiraling downwards into a major economic crisis, as I'm talking about. There's energy shortages across Europe. I noticed that the Italian government is now talking about imposing price caps on the price of gas, something which is if it's ever done, is guaranteed to create shortages. But, that's another story. We have these economic problems building as well. Realistically, this is not the time to start thinking about rebuilding military industrial bases. This is too late for that. We need to start instead thinking about what we need to do in the short and medium term, and that, it seems to me, dictates pursuing a policy of peace. But I'm going to discuss all of that in another program as well. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. Disastrous news for Ukraine in Donbass. The battle in Lugansk region is coming to an end. The greater battle for Donbass is now, I think, clearly within sight of its end. And confirmation from the Royal United Services Institute, from an article published by the Royal United Services Institute, that there is absolutely no realistic possibility of the United States rearming Ukraine to the level needed to take on Russia, and that the United States anyway is would struggle to match Russian levels of production in critical areas, in missile production, in ammunition, in the kind of things which have proved decisive in the Ukraine war. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. Remember, you can get us on Rumble and Locals. If you go to Rumble, you can, of course, press that red maroon button, and that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where, of course, we have a thriving community which you can join, and where we publish exclusive content. I did an absolutely amazing and wonderful live stream. Wonderful because of the wonderful and insightful questions I got asked yesterday, as I always do every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And of course, you can also find us on other platforms like ODYSEE and SuperU, and you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, you can go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our bomber jackets, and all those great things that you will find there. And of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon.